And now we will have here Jordan Maris from OSI, Open Source Initiative, which is an organization in the ecosystem of free software organizations. Welcome. It's the first time you are here at SFSCon, and you will talk to us about open source in EU policy. Welcome, Jordan. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It is really a delight to be here. My first time at SFSCon. It's also a delight to hear the amazing stories of the people who won the awards this year, so congratulations again to them. It's really inspiring stuff. Now we're moving from something onto something maybe a bit less exciting, but hopefully still very interesting. Open source in the EU policy landscape. My name's Jordan Maris. I'm a policy analyst for the Open Source Initiative. I started with OSI just 2 short months ago, and I'm working from Brussels. I'm also a long-term user of open source software. I started when I was given an Ubuntu Live CD at the age of 10, and after spending far longer than I should have trying to get the Wi-Fi drivers working, when I eventually succeeded, I realized that anything was possible, so I decided to go into politics. So for the past 3 years, I've been a staffer at the European Parliament. I've worked on the vast majority of the tech legislation that the European Union have come out with, and I've always had a particular focus on the role of open source software. Most recently, I worked on the Artificial Intelligence Act, the Product Liability Directive, and the dreaded Cyber Resilience Act, for which I am deeply sorry. As you've seen, a lot has happened in the past 5 or 6 years when it comes to European tech policy. There's been a bit of a sort of wave of new legislation coming in. It started in 2019 when the role of technology was clearly increasing in our lives, and some of the problems that come with it were more and more evident. And when the EU finds problems, the logical response for them is regulation. So a while ago now, we started out with the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act, which was designed to sort of improve moderation online and make sure that everyone has the opportunity to compete fairly. Then we had the Data Act, which is about IoT data. We had the AI Act, all about artificial intelligence, the European Digital Identity, so soon an ID card in your pocket. The Product Liability Directive, which is about getting money when a product hurts you. And most recently, the Cyber Resilience Act, which is about the security of products on the EU market, both software and physical. So what I've come to really talk to you about today, and the kind of theory I want to put forwards, is that EU lawmakers' understanding of open source has changed enormously over the past couple of years. And we've gone from ignorance to innocence, and hopefully now, experience. So what does this look like in practice? Well, when we rewind back to the initial work on the AI Act, truth be told, lawmakers didn't really understand what open source was. There was maybe a very small group of enthusiasts. I could name 2 or 3 MEPs and a handful of people at the European Commission who had an interest in open source. There was a strategy for using open source in public administration, but nobody thought that open source belonged in laws. Similarly, there weren't very many connections with the community. Politicians were disconnected from us. And so they didn't know how their work would impact us. And that started to change around 2022. There were a couple of things that happened. First of all, there was an exemption put into the AI Act by some members of the European Parliament, which I might talk to you a bit more about later, for open source software. And I think most importantly, around this period, a report was published with a big number, 93 billion euros, which was the amount that open source was adding to the European economy. In addition to this, there was another number, 90%, which is the amount of software which integrates open source components. So suddenly, open source goes from being this niche little corner thing to something that more and more lawmakers are understanding is very important. So what we then had is the exemptions. So for the Product Liability Directive and Cyber Resilience Act, they threw in some exemptions for open source software. These exemptions were well-intended, but clearly showed that there wasn't really an understanding of how open source works. So it was clear that they wanted to do good, but they didn't really understand. And again, there were no connections with the open source community. So they didn't know who to ask. Finally, now we're reaching the better stage, experience. So in this stage, lawmakers have started to understand how important it is to speak to the open source community. They've realized that they made mistakes in the past, and they're working to rectify them. And so the community is finding itself more and more involved in politics in Brussels, and it's gone from being a case of they'll come to us to a case of, okay, we need to go to the community, which is a massive step forward in my view. But let's just talk a little bit briefly about why the community had to mobilize in the first place. So, as I said, there was this very heavy focus on regulating technology over the past couple of years. And when the EU gets into this sort of a frenzy, usually they will put out quite a few laws in a row. The EU also had this problem of a lack of experience with the fourth sector. I'm going to take this moment to shout out to Simon Phipps, who wrote an amazing article on that issue. Essentially, what I mean by that is the EU are used to speaking to companies, they're used to speaking to trade unions, and they're used to speaking to consumer organizations. But open source is in this fourth category in some cases, especially when it comes to community-led projects, which doesn't fit into the paradigm that lawmakers are used to. So part of the reason the community had to mobilize was to say, we're here, and to help the lawmakers understand that we are actually vital. Finally, of course, there was the lack of understanding of free and open source software, which has been an issue for a very long time, which they're only finally starting to fix. So what's changed? As I said, lawmakers now come to us. The presence of the open source community in Brussels has grown. There are now 7 people working full-time on open source policy in Brussels. It's very nice not to have to go to lunch alone anymore. Open source is now beginning to be understood as being inherently valuable, so as a sort of public good. I think the best way to explain it for a normal person is, for a while now, the European Union has understood that there's some sort of inherent value in small and medium businesses, right? That they're important, they need to be protected, they need to be nurtured. I think that now the same is becoming true of open source software, which is really a major step forwards for us. It means that in every law now, open source is a consideration, and not just in laws directly relating to tech. As you'll see, there are a wide variety of laws where open source is important. So what comes now? We've reached this level of experience. Lawmakers know about us. How do we make the best of it? Well, only 3 things in life are certain: death, taxes, and, to paraphrase that, EU regulation. So we have a lot still in the pipeline. Coming up, as soon as we have a new European Commission, will be an AI liability directive, which may, God forbid, be converted into a software liability directive. We have 11 new laws coming on tech policy, which could influence the open source community. 4 non-legislative initiatives, so big projects set up by the European Union. We have standardization and patent reform, which could have a massive positive impact on the open source community. We have the European Union budget, where funding for FOSS projects is on the line. And we have the implementation of many of the laws which I've already talked to you about, including the AI Act, Cyber Resilience Act, and Product Liability Directive. So, what is the OSI doing? Well, first and foremost, I haven't had the opportunity to speak to you about it yet, but we're going to be promoting work on our open source AI definition. I'm going to take a while after this to present that a little bit to you. We're going to be working to make sure that the Cyber Resilience Act is implemented in a way that's friendly for the FOSS community and that's actually feasible so they can focus on doing what's important, writing the code and building their products. We're going to work towards standardization with open source in mind. So by this I mean, as of now, when the EU makes a law, in general, compliance with that law is achieved through standards. The issue is historically, because of the way standardization has been done, these standards are often encumbered by patents. And this can be a real blocker for open source projects who want to implement that standard and hence to follow EU law. Now, The European Union are in the process of rethinking their standardization approach, and that's something that's very important to us. So we're going to try and make sure that the new approach will be more friendly to the open source community so that standardization is really done with us in mind. And there's been some incredible progress on that already. You can see with, for example, the Cyber Resilience Act that the requests for standardization specifically include involvement of the open source community in the process. And that's a first. It's an opportunity that we really have to make the best of, and it's an opportunity to really change the way things are done for the better. Obviously, we'll continue the work which we've been doing for a very long time, which is informing lawmakers about open source software. Now it's much easier, I believe, than it used to be, thanks to the extremely hard work of my colleagues at OSI and lots of other people in the open source community. And finally, of course, we'll be strengthening our network in Brussels, trying to find like-minded organizations who will help us work on this tech policy and achieve a greater impact in Brussels. Now, I want to move on to perhaps a specific example, one that's kind of a bit personal to me. So a long time ago, before ChatGPT, in a parliament far, far away, because yes, it is extremely difficult to get from Brussels to Bolzano, there was a young and very naive policy advisor who was just finishing his first negotiation, sat around a table in a windowless and very stuffy room. And the meeting was coming to a close, and the lead negotiator said, "Is there any other business?" And the young policy advisor raised his hand and said, "What about open source?" Little did he know, he was about to create a lot of problems for a great many people. And so, yeah, this was me during the beginning of negotiations on the Artificial Intelligence Act around 2022. The result of what I ended up doing with the help of lots of other people was the creation of an exemption in the AI Act for open source. Unfortunately, this exemption was nowhere near precise enough. I was still in the innocent stage back then. And as a result, it's been exploited very recently by a handful of companies who've been claiming their AI systems are open source when they are very much not. I was delighted after I finished my term in Parliament that OSI opened up a position. And I figured it was time to right the wrong that I had created and try to do some good things. Now, OSI had been working at that time on an open source AI definition for quite a while. But in Brussels, nobody was aware. They were still in the ignorance phase. So a while back, I went with Simon to Brussels, and we, by chance, completely by chance, ran into one of the people who worked on the AI Act. I explained what OSI does, our role as a steward of the open source definition, and he immediately responded, "I have a question for you. What is open source AI?" And I had to reassure Simon that I had not paid the guy off to come and say that. And he was right to have that question, because it's very difficult to define what open source AI is, and that's what the OSI have been doing over the past 2 years, I believe, in a process that's been extremely complicated. We've been on tour around lots of conferences. There have been lots of very difficult and complicated discussions. We've tried to include as many people directly in the process as we can, but we've come up with something which we think is reasonable. So obviously, the most important things are the 4 freedoms: the freedom to use, study, modify, and share any AI system that's developed. Now, that obviously includes all of the source code used for data processing, training, and of course, for running the model itself. It also includes the model parameters and the training data, plus what we call data information. So we kept running into an issue with the training data, which is that some data might not actually be accessible to the public. And of course, everyone's immediate reaction, everyone's immediate thought is, well, all the data should be open, right? The issue you run into, for example, is, let's say you're building an AI that's in the domain of health. A lot of the training data you might have to use for that could come from people's private health data. It might be things that they've volunteered, but they wouldn't want to be made public. Similarly, some of the data could be transient. So, it might be something that's recorded directly, but the storing would not be possible. So how do we work out a solution that works for this? Well, first of all, any data that is publicly available is listed. When it's open, it's included. Similarly, if there's data that's not publicly available, it should also be listed, and the location where it can be obtained should be supplied. Similarly, for data that can't be shared, for example, because it was transient, so it was not stored, it was simply directly fed into the model, or can't be shared for privacy reasons, for example, it was patient data, it was whatever, a clear and detailed description of that data needs to be available. And the gist of it is, anybody with a reasonable amount of knowledge should then be able to recreate a similar data set to build the AI system. So perhaps it's not perfect, but we think this is the best starting place. And most importantly, we think it's vital because of the situation right now around the world. I spoke to you before very briefly about the issue of open washing. And that open washing is possible because of the exemption in the AI Act, which I created. So a lot of the people who are a lot of the people who are doing this open washing are doing it because it allows them to get away with not complying with the AI Act. And so it's very, very important that we work out a way to show lawmakers, to clearly tell lawmakers what is and what is not open source. This definition will be a first step. I think everybody knows that when the open source definition was created, and a lot of similar things, it took a long time for us to get to the right place. A lot of people will know that the freedom to use actually was added a bit later on and became the zero freedom. So our hope is that we've set a starting place and that we can continue to work and improve the definition as time goes on, that we're going to be spending plenty of time in Brussels explaining this definition to lawmakers and, of course, to parliamentary staffers who, to be honest, do most of the work. We're also participating in the European Commission Working Group on Codes of Practice for General-Purpose Artificial Intelligence, which is an extremely long and boring name, but is an opportunity for practitioners of AI, open source organizations to come together and discuss how the AI Act needs to be enforced. Now, our goal is to make sure that the four freedoms are respected by all AI systems which are considered open source, so free of usage restrictions and other such problems. We're also spending a lot of time in Brussels now highlighting the problems with open washing, be it speaking to lawmakers, to the European Commission themselves, writing letters, and so on. And finally, we're presenting our work on the open source AI definition, both to lawmakers and to the wider Brussels community, in the hope that we can make it the standard, and in the hope that we can ensure through that that the AI Act is enforced properly and well. So thank you very much for your time. I'm a little ahead of time.